Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. This was the like of which they had never come across in anyone before. They would have forgiven his going to the houses of bores, to whom, as it happened in his heart of hearts, he infinitely preferred the Verdurins and all their little nucleus, had he consented to set a good example by openly renouncing those bores in the presence of the faithful, but that was an abjuration which, as they well knew, they were powerless to extort. What a difference was there in a newcomer whom Odette had asked them to invite, although she herself had met him only a few times, the Comte de Forqueville. It turned out that he was nothing more or less than the brother-in-law of Sagnette, a discovery of which filled all the faithful with amazement. The manners of the old paleographer were so humble that they had always supposed him to be of a class inferior socially to their own, and had never expected to learn that he came of a rich and relatively aristocratic family. Of course, Forqueville was enormously the swell, which Swann was not, or had quite ceased to be. Of course, he would never dream of placing, as Swann now placed, the Verdurin circle above any other, but he lacked that natural refinement which prevented Swann from associating himself with the criticisms, too obviously false to be worth his notice, that Madame Verdurin levelled at people whom he knew. As for the vulgar and affected tirades in which the painter sometimes indulged, the bagman's pleasantries which Cottard used to hazard, whereas Swann, who, like both men, sincerely could easily find excuses for these without having either the courage or the hypocrisy to applaud them, Forqueville, on the other hand, was on an intellectual level which permitted him to be stupefied, amazed by the invective, without in the least understanding what it all was about, and to be frankly delighted by the wit. And the very first dinner at the Verdurins at which Forqueville was present threw a glaring light upon all the differences between them, made his qualities start into prominence, and precipitated the disgrace of Swann. There was at this dinner, besides the usual party, a professor from the Sorbonne, one Bricotte, who had met Monsieur Verdun at a watering-place somewhere, and if his duties at the university and his other works of scholarship had not left him with very little time to spare, would gladly have come to them more often, for he had that curiosity, that superstitious outlook on life, which, combined with a certain amount of skepticism with regard to the object of their studies, earned for men of intelligence, whatever their profession, for doctors who do not believe in medicine, for schoolmasters who do not believe in Latin exercises, the reputation of having broad, brilliant, and indeed superior minds. He affected, when at Madame Verdun's, to choose his illustrations from among the most tropical subjects of the day, when he spoke of philosophy or history, principally because he regarded those sciences as no more really than a preparation for life itself, and imagined that he was seeing put into practice by the little clan what hitherto he had only known from books, and also, perhaps, because, having drilled into him as a boy, and having unconsciously preserved a feeling of reverence for certain subjects, he thought that he was casting aside the scholar's gown when he ventured to treat those subjects with a conversational license which seemed so to him only because the folds of the gown still clung. Early in the course of the dinner, when Monsieur de Forqueville, seated on the right of Madame Verdun, who, in the newcomer's honor, had taken great pains with her toilet, observed to her, quite original, that white dress, the doctor, who had never taken his eyes off of him, so curious was he to learn the nature and attributes of what he called a dé, and was on the lookout for an opportunity of attracting his attention so as to come into closer contact with him, caught in its flight the adjective blanc, and his eyes still glued to his plate, snapped out, Blanc? Blanc of Castile? then without moving his head shot a furtive glance to his right and left of him, doubtful but happy on the whole, while Swann, by the painful and futile effort which he made to smile, testified that he thought the pun absurd. Forqueville had shown at once that he could appreciate its subtlety, and that he was a man of the world by keeping within its proper limits of mirth, the spontaneity of which he had charmed Madame Verdun. "What are you to say of a science like that?" she asked Forqueville. "You can't talk seriously to him for 2 minutes on end. Is that the sort of thing you tell them at your hospital?" she went on, turning to the doctor. "They must have some pretty lively times there. If that's the case, I can see that I shall have to get taken in as a patient." "I think I heard the doctor speak of that wicked old humbug, Blanc of Castile. If I may so express myself, am I not right, madame?" Bricout appealed to Madame Verdun, who, swooning with merriment, her eyes tightly closed, had buried her face into her 2 hands, from between which now and then escaped a muffled scream. "Good gracious, madame, I would not dream of shocking the reverent-minded, if there are any such around this table, Sabrosa. I recognize, moreover, that our ineffable and Athenian, oh, how infinitely Athenian republic is capable of honoring, in the person of the obscuratest old Chicapé, the first of our chiefs of police. Yes, indeed, my dear host, yes, indeed," he repeated in his ringing voice, which sounded a separate note for each syllable, in reply to a protest by Madame Verdun. "The Chronicle of St. Denis, and the authenticity of its information is beyond question, leaves us no room for doubt on that point. No one could be more fitly chosen as patron by a secularizing proletariat than that mother of a saint who let him see some pretty fishy saints beside, as Suger says, and other great St. Bernards of the sort, for with her it was a case of taking just what you pleased." "Who is that gentleman?" Forqueville asked Madame Verdun. "He seems to speak with great authority." "What? Do you mean to say you don't know the famous Bricout? Why, he's celebrated all over Europe." "Oh, that's Bricout, is it?" exclaimed Forqueville, who had not quite caught the name. "You must tell me all about him," he went on, fastening a pair of goggle eyes on the celebrity. "It's always interesting to meet well-known people at dinner. But I say, you ask us to very select parties here. No dull evenings in this house, I'm sure." "Well, you know what it is really," said Madame Verdun modestly. "They feel safe here. They can talk about whatever they like, and the conversation goes off like fireworks. Now, Bricout this evening is nothing. I've seen him, don't you know, when he's been with me. Simply dazzling. You want to go on your knees to him. Well, without anyone else, he's not the same man. He's not in the least witty. You have to drag the words out of him. He's even boring." "That's strange," remarked Forqueville with fitting astonishment. A sort of wit like Bricout's would have been regarded as out-and-out stupidity by the people among whom Swann had spent his early life, for all that it is quite compatible with real intelligence, and the intelligence of the professor's vigorous and well-nourished brain might easily have been envied by many of the people in society who seemed witty enough to Swann. But these last had so thoroughly inculcated into him their likes and dislikes, at least in everything that pertained to their ordinary social existence, including that annex to social extension which belongs, strictly speaking, to the domain of intelligence, namely, conversation, that Swann could not see anything in Bricout's pleasantries to him that were merely pedantic, vulgar, and disgustingly coarse. He was shocked, too, being accustomed to good manners, by the rude, almost barrack-room tone which the student in arms adopted, no matter to whom he was speaking. Finally, perhaps, he had lost all patience that evening as he watched Madame Verdun welcoming with such unnecessary warmth this Forqueville fellow, whom it had been Odette's unaccountable idea to bring to the house. Feeling a little awkward, with Swann there also, she had asked him on arrival, "What do you think of my guest?" And he, suddenly realizing for the first time that Forqueville, whom he had known for years, could actually attract a woman, and was quite a good specimen of man, he retorted, "Beastly." He had certainly no idea of being jealous of Odette, but did not feel quite so happy as usual. And when Bricot, having begun to tell them the story of Blanc of Castile's mother, who, according to him, had been with Henry Plantagenet for years before they were married, tried to prompt Swann to beg him to continue the story by interjecting, "Isn't that so, Monsieur Swann?" In the martial accents which one uses in order to get down to the level of an unintelligent rustic, or to put the fear of God into a trooper, Swann cut his story short, to the intense fury of their hostess, by begging to be excused for taking so little interest in Blanc de Castile, as he had something that he wished to ask the painter for. He, it appeared, had been that afternoon to an exhibition of the work of another artist, also a friend of Madame Verdun, who had recently died, and Swann wished to find out from him, for he valued his discrimination, whether there had really been anything more in this later work than the virtuosity which had struck people so forcibly in his earlier exhibitions. From that point of view it was extraordinary, but it did not seem to me to be a form of art which you'd call elevated, said Swann with a smile. Elevated to the height of an institute, interrupted Cottard, raising his arms with mock solemnity. The whole table burst out laughing. "What did I tell you?" said Madame Verdun to Forqueville. "It's simply impossible to be serious with him. When you least expect it, out he comes with a joke." But she observed that Swann, and Swann alone, had not unbent. For one thing, he was none too well pleased with Cottard for having secured a laugh at his expense in front of Forqueville, but the painter, instead of replying in a way that might have interested Swann, as he would probably have done had they been alone together, preferred to win the easy admiration of the rest by exercising his wit upon the talent of their dear friend. "I went up to one of them," he began, "just to see how it was done. I stuck my nose into it. Yes, I don't think impossible to say whether it was done with glue, with soap, with sealing wax, with sunshine, with leaven, with excrement. And one make 12, shouted the doctor wittily, just too late, for no one saw the point of his interruption. "It looks as though it were done with nothing at all," resumed the painter. "No more chance of discovering the trick that there is in the Night Watch or the Regents, and it's even bigger work than either Rembrandt or Hals ever did. It's all there, and yet no, I'll take my oath it isn't." Then, just as singers who had reached the highest note in their compass proceeded to hum the rest of the air in falsetto, he had to be satisfied with murmuring, smiling the while, as if, after all, there had been something irresistibly amusing in the sheer beauty of the painting. "It smells all right. It makes your head go round. It catches your breath. You feel ticklish all over, and not the faintest clue to how it's done. The man's a sorcerer. The thing's a conjuring trick. It's a miracle." Bursting outright into laughter, "It's dishonest." Then, stopping solemnly, raising his head, pitching his voice on a double bass note, which he struggled to bring into harmony, he concluded, "And it's so loyal." Except at the moment when he called it bigger than the Night Watch, a blasphemy which had called forth an instant protest from Madame Verdun, who regarded the Night Watch as the supreme masterpiece of the universe, conjointly with the Ninth and the Samothrace, and at the word excrement, which had made Forqueville throw a sweeping glance round the table to see whether it was all right before he allowed his lips to curve in a prudish and conciliatory smile. All the party, save Swann had kept their fascinated and adoring eyes fixed on the painter. "I'd so love him when he goes up in the air like that," cried Madame Verdun, the moment that he had finished, enraptured that the table talk should have proved so entertaining on the very night that Forqueville was dining with them for the first time. "Hello, you," she turned to her husband. "What's the matter with you, sitting there gaping like a great animal? You know, though, don't you," she apologized for him to the painter, "that he can talk quite well when he chooses. Anybody would think it was the first time he had ever listened to you. If you had only seen him while you were speaking, he was just drinking it all in, and tomorrow he will tell us everything you said, without missing a word." "No, really, I'm not joking," protested the painter, enchanted by the success of his speech. "You all look as though you thought I was pulling your legs, that it was just a trick. I'll take you to see the show, and then you can say whether I've been exaggerating. I'll bet you anything you like you'll come away with more up in the air than I. But we don't suppose for a minute that you're exaggerating. We only want you to go on with your dinner, and my husband too. Give Mr. Beck some more soul. Can't you see his has gotten cold? We're not in any hurry. You're dashing round as if the house is on fire. Wait a little. Don't serve the salad yet." Madame Coutard, who was a shy woman and spoke but seldom, was not lacking, for all that, in self-assurance when a happy inspiration put the right word in her mouth. She felt that it was well received. The thought gave her confidence, and what she was doing was done with the object not so much of shining herself as of helping her husband on in his career, and so she did not allow the word salad, which Madame Verdun had just uttered, to pass unchallenged. "It's not a Japanese salad, is it?" she whispered, turning towards Odette. And then, in her joy and confusion at the combination of neatness and daring which there had been made so discreet and yet so unmistakable an allusion to the new and brilliantly successful play by Dumas, she broke down in a charming girlish laugh, not very loud, but so irresistible that it was some time before she could control it. "Who is that lady? She seems devilishly clever," said Forqueville. "No, it is not. But we will have one for you if you will all come to dinner on Friday." "You will think me dreadfully provincial, sir," said Madame Coutard to Swann, "but do you know I haven't been yet to this famous Francillon that everyone's talking about? The doctor has been. I remember now he told me what a great pleasure it had been to him to spend the evening with you there. And I must confess, I don't see much sense in spending money on seats for him to take me, when he's seen the play already. Of course, an evening at the Théâtre Français is never wasted really, the acting's so good there always. But we have some nice friends." Madame Coutard could hardly ever utter a proper name, but restricted herself to "some friends of ours," or "one of my friends," as being more distinguished, speaking in an affected tone, and with all the importance of a person who need give names only when she chooses, who often have a box, and are kind enough to take us to all the new pieces that are worth going to, and so I'm certain to see this Francillon sooner or later, and then I shall know what to think. But I do feel such a fool about it, I must confess, for whenever I pay a call there I find everybody talking. It's only natural about that wretched Japanese salad. Really and truly, one's beginning to get just a little tired of hearing about it," she went on, seeing that Swann seemed less interested than she had hoped in so burning a topic. "I must admit, though, that it's sometimes quite amusing the way they joke about it. I've got a friend now who is most original, though she's really a beautiful woman, most popular in society, goes everywhere, and she tells me that she got her cook to make one of these Japanese salads, putting in everything that young Monsieur Dumas says you're to put in the play. Then she asked just a few friends to come and taste it. It was not among the favored few, I'm sorry to say, but she told us all about it on her next day. It seemed it was quite horrible. She made us all laugh till we cried. I don't know, perhaps it was the way she told it." Madame Cottard added doubtfully, seeing Swann still looked grave, and imagining that it was, perhaps, because he had not been amused by Francillon. Well, I dare say I shall be disappointed with it after all. I don't suppose it's as good as the piece Madame du Crequy worships, Serge Panine. There's a play, if you like, so deep, makes you think. But just fancy giving a receipt for a salad on the stage of the Théâtre Français. Now, Serge Panine, but then it's like everything that comes from the pen of Monsieur Georges Jeunet. He's so well written. I wonder if you know the Maître d'Esphore, which I like even better than Serge Panine. Pardon me, said Swann with polite irony, but I can assure you that my want of admiration is almost equally divided between those masterpieces. Really now, that's very interesting. And what don't you like about them? Won't you ever change your mind? Perhaps you're looking a little too sad. Well, what I always say is one should never argue about plays or novels. Everyone has his own way of looking at things, and what may be horrible to you is perhaps just what I like best. She was interrupted by Forqueville's addressing Swann. What had happened was that, while Madame Cottard was discussing Francillon, Forqueville had been expressing to Madame Verdun his admiration for what he called the little speech of the painter. "Your friend has such a flow of language, such a memory," he had said to her when the painter had come to a standstill. "I've seldom seen anything like it. He'd make a first-rate preacher. By Jove, I wish I was like that. What with him and Monsieur Bercotte, you've drawn 2 lucky numbers tonight, though I'm not sure that, simply as a speaker, this one's doesn't knock spots off the professor. It comes more naturally with him, less like reading from a book. Of course, the way he goes on, he does use some words that are a bit realistic and all that, but that's quite the thing nowadays anyhow. It's not often I've seen a man holding the floor as cleverly as that hold the spiton, as we used to say in the regiment, where, by the way, we had a man he rather reminds me of. You could take anything you liked. I don't know what this glass say, and he'd talk away about it for hours. No, not this glass. That's a silly thing to say. I'm sorry, but something a little bigger, like the Battle of Waterloo, or anything of that sort. He'd tell you things you simply wouldn't believe. Why, Swann was in the regiment then. You must have known him. Do you see much of Monsieur Swann? Asked Madame Verdun. Oh dear, no, he answered, and then, thinking that if he had made himself pleasant to Swann he might find favor with Odette, he decided to take this opportunity of flattering him by speech of his fashionable friends, but speaking as a man of the world himself in a tone of good-natured criticism, and not as though he were congratulating Swann upon some undeserved fortune. Isn't that so, Swann? I never see anything of you, do I? And then, where on earth is one to see him? The creature spends all his time shut up with the La Tremoiles, with the looms, and all that. The imputation would have been false at any time, and was all the more so now that for at least a year Swann had given up going to almost any house but the Verduns. The mere names of families whom the Verduns did not know were received by them in reproachful silence. Monsieur Verdun, dreading the painful impression which the mention of these bores, especially when flung at her in this tactless fashion in front of all of the faithful, was bound to make on his wife, cast a covert glance at her, instinct with anxious solicitude. He saw then that in her fixed resolution to take no notice, to have escaped contact altogether with the news which had just been addressed to her, not merely to remain dumb, but to have been deaf as well, as we pretend to be when a friend who has been in the wrong attempts to slip into his conversation some excuse which we should appear to be accepting, should we appear to have heard it without protesting, or when someone utters the name of an enemy, the very mention of whom in our presence is forbidden. Madame Verdun, so that her silence should have the appearance not of consent, but of the unconscious silence which inanimate objects preserve, had suddenly emptied her face of all life, of all mobility. Her rounded forehead was nothing now, but an exquisite study in high relief, which the name of those La Tremoils, with whom Swann was always shut up, had failed to penetrate. Her nose, just perceptibly wrinkled in a frown, exposed to view two dark cavities that were surely modelled from life. You would have said that her half-opened lips were just about to speak. It was all no more, however, than a wax cast, a mask, a plaster, the sculptor's design for a monument, a bust to be exhibited in the Palace of Industry, where the public would most certainly gather in front of it and marvel to see how the sculptor, in expressing the unchallengeable dignity of the Verduns as opposed to that of the La Tremoils or the Laumes, whose equals, if not indeed their betters, they were, and the equals and betters of all other boors upon the face of the earth, had managed to invest with a majesty that was almost papal the whiteness and rigidity of his stone. But the marble at last grew animated, and let it be understood that it didn't do to be at all squeamish if one went to that house, since the woman was always tipsy, and the husband so uneducated that he called a corridor a corridor. You need to pay me a lot of money before I'd let any of that lot set foot inside my house, Madame Verdun concluded, gazing imperially down on Swann. She could scarcely have expected him to capitulate so completely as to echo the simplicity of the pianist's aunt, who at once exclaimed, "To think of that now! What surprises me is that they can let anybody to go near them. I'm sure I should be afraid. One can't be too careful. How can people be so common as to go running after them?" But he might at least have replied like Forqueville, "Gad, she's a duchess. There are still plenty of people who are impressed by that sort of thing," which would have at least have permitted Madame Verdun the final retort, "And a lot of good may it do them," instead of which Swann merely smiled, in a manner which showed quite clearly that he could not, of course, take such an absurd suggestion seriously. Monsieur Verdun, who was still casting furtive and intermittent glances at his wife, could see with regret, and could understand only too well, that she was now inflamed with the passion of a grand inquisitor who cannot succeed in stamping out heresy, and so, in the hope of bringing Swann round to a retraction, for the courage of one's opinion is always a form of calculating cowardice in the eyes of the other side, he broke in. "To us, frankly, now, what you think of them yourself. We shan't repeat it to them, you may be sure." To which Swann answered, "Why, I'm not in the least afraid of the Duchess. If it is of the La Tremoille that you're speaking, I assure you that every one likes going to see her. I don't go so far as to say that she's all deep." He pronounced the word as if it meant something ridiculous, for his speech kept the traces of certain mental habits which the recent change in his life, a rejuvenation illustrated by his passion for music, had inclined him temporarily to discard, so that at times he would actually state his views with considerable warmth. "But I am quite certain when I say that she is intelligent, while her husband is positively a bookworm. They are charming people." His explanation was terribly effective. Madame Verdun now realized that this one state of unbelief would prevent her little nucleus from ever attaining unanimity, and was unable to restrain herself in her fury at the obstinacy of this wretch, who could now see what anguish his words were causing her, but cried aloud from the depths of her tortured heart, "You may think so if you wish, but at least you need not say so to us." It all depends on what you call intelligence. Forqueville felt his turn to be brilliant. Come now, Swann, tell us what you mean by intelligence. There, cried Odette, that's one of the big things I beg him to tell me about, and he never will. Oh, but, protested Swann. Oh, but nonsense, said Odette. A water butt? Asked the doctor. To you, pursued Forqueville, does intelligence mean what they call clever talk, you know, the sort of people who worm their way into society? Finish your sweet so that they can take your plate away, said Madame Verdun sourly to Saniette, who was lost in thought and had stopped eating, and then, perhaps a little ashamed of her rudeness, it doesn't matter. Take your time about it. There's no hurry. I only reminded you because of the others. You know, it keeps the servants back. There is, began Bricot, with a resonant smack upon every syllable, a rather curious definition of intelligence by that pleasing old anarchist Fenelon. Just listen to this, Madame Verdun rallied Forqueville and the doctor. He's going to give us Fenelon's definition of intelligence. That's interesting. It's not often you get a chance of hearing that. But Bricot was keeping Fenelon's definition until Swann should have given it his own. Swann remained silent, and by this fresh act of recreancy spoiled the brilliant tournament of dialectic which Madame Verdun was rejoicing at being able to offer to Forqueville. You see, it's just the same as with me, Odette was peevish. I'm not at all sorry to see that I'm not the only one he doesn't find quite up to his level. These de la Trémollet, whom Madame Verdun has exhibited to us, are so little to be desired, inquired Bricot, articulating vigorously. Are they by any chance descended from the couple whom the worthy old snob Swann said she was delighted to know, because it was so good for her parents? True, the Marquise had another reason, which in her case probably came first, for she was a thorough journalist at heart, and always on the lookout for copy, and in the journal which she used to send regularly to her daughter, it was Madame de la Trémollet, kept well informed through all her connections, who supplied the foreign politics. Oh dear, no, I'm quite sure they aren't the same family, said Madame Verdun desperately. Saniette, who, ever since he had suffered an untouched plate to the butler, had been plunged once more into silent meditation, emerged finally to tell them, with a nervous laugh, a story of how he had once dined with the Duc de la Trémollet, the point of which was that the Duke did not know that George Sand was the pseudonym of a woman. Swann, who really liked Saniette, felt bound to supply him with a few facts illustrative of the Duke's culture, which would prove that such ignorance on his part was literally impossible. But suddenly he stopped short. He had realized, as he was speaking, that Saniette needed no proof, but knew already that the story was untrue, for the simple reason that he had at that moment invented it. The worthy man suffered acutely from the Verduns always finding him so dull, and as he was conscious of having been more than ordinarily morose this evening, he had made up his mind that he would succeed in being amusing at least once before the end of dinner. He surrendered so quickly, looked so wretched at the sight of his castle in ruins, and replied in so craven a tone to Swann, appealing to him not to persist in a refutation which was already superfluous. All right, anyhow, if I have made a mistake, that's not a crime, I hope. That Swann longed to be able to console him by insisting that the story was indubitably true and exquisitely funny. The doctor, who had been listening, had an idea that it was the right moment to interject, "C'est non vero." But he was not quite certain of the words, and was afraid of being caught out. After dinner, Forqueville went up to the doctor. "She can't have been all that bad-looking, Madame Verdun. Anyway, she's a woman you can really talk to. That's all I want. Of course, she's getting a bit broad in the beam, but Madame du Crequy. There's a little woman who knows what's what, all right. Upon my word and soul, you could see at a glance she's got the American eye, that girl has. We are speaking of Madame du Crequy, he explained as Monsieur Verdun joined them, his pipe in his mouth. I should say that, as a specimen of the female form, I'd rather have it in my bed than a clap of thunder. The words came tumbling out from Cottard, who had for some time been waiting in vain until Forqueville should pause for breath, so that he might get in his horrid joke, a chance for which might not, he feared, come again if the conversation should take a different turn. And he produced it now with that excess of spontaneity and confidence which may often be noticed attempting to cover up the coldness and the slight flutter of emotion inseparable from a prepared recitation. Forqueville knew and saw the joke, and was thoroughly amused. As for Monsieur Verdun, he was unsparing of his merriment, having recently discovered a way of expressing it by a symbol, different from his wife's, but equally simple and obvious. Scarcely he had begun the movement of head and shoulders of a man who was shaking with laughter than he would begin also to cough, as though in laughing too violently he'd swallowed a mouthful of smoke from his pipe, and by keeping the pipe firmly in his mouth he could prolong indefinitely the dumb show of suffocation and hilarity. So he and Madame Verdun, who, at the other side of the room where the painter was telling her a story, was shutting her eyes preparatory to flinging her face into her hands, resembled two masks in a theatre, each representing comedy, but in a different way. Monsieur Verdun had been wiser than he knew in not taking his pipe out of his mouth, for Cottard, having occasion to leave the room for a moment, murmured a witty euphemism which he had recently acquired and repeated now whenever he had to go to the place in question. I must just go and see the Duc d'Aumale for a moment, so drolly that Monsieur Verdun's cough began all over again. Now then, take your pipe out of your mouth, can't you see? You'll choke if you try to bottle up your laughter like that, counselled Madame Verdun, as she came round with the tray of liqueurs. What a delightful man your husband is! He has the wit of a dozen, declared Forqueville to Madame Cottard. Thank you, and a soldier like me can never say no to a drink. Monsieur de Forqueville thinks Odette charming, Monsieur Verdun told his wife. Why, do you know, she wants so much to meet you again some day at luncheon. We must arrange it, but don't on any account let Swann hear about it. He spoils everything, don't you know? I don't mean to say that you're not to come to dinner too, of course. We hope to see you very often, now that the weather's warming. We're going to have dinner out of doors whenever we can. That won't bore you, will it? A quiet little dinner now and then in the boy? Splendid. That will be quite delightful. Aren't you going to do any work this evening, I say? She screamed suddenly to the little pianist, seeing an opportunity for displaying before a newcomer of Forqueville's importance at once her unfailing wit and her despotic power over the faithful. Monsieur de Forqueville was just going to say something dreadful about you, Madame Cottard warned her husband as he reappeared in the room, and he, still following up the idea of Forqueville's noble birth, which had obsessed him all through dinner, began again with it. I'm treating a baroness just now. Baroness Potbus. Weren't there some Potbuses in the Crusades? Anyhow, they've got a lake in Pomerania that's 10 times the size of the place de la Concorde. I'm treating her for dry arthritis. She's a charming woman. Madame Verdun knows her too, I believe, which enabled Forqueville a moment later, finding himself alone with Madame Cottard, to complete his favorable verdict on her husband with, he's an interesting man, too. You can see that he knows some good people. God, but they get to know a lot of things, these doctors. Do you want me to play the little phrase from the sonata for Monsieur Swann? asked the pianist. "What the devil's that? Not the sonata snake, I hope," shouted Monsieur de Forqueville, hoping to create an effect, but Cottard, who had never heard this pun, missed the point of it, and imagined that Monsieur de Forqueville had made a mistake. He dashed in boldly to correct it. No, the word isn't serpenta sonatas. It's serpenta sonates," he explained in a tone at once zealous, impatient, and triumphant. Forqueville explained the joke to him. The doctor blushed. "You admit it's not bad, eh, doctor? Oh, I've known it for ages." Then they were silenced, heralded by the waving tremolo of the violin part, which formed a bristling bodyguard of sound 2 octaves above it, and as in a mountainous country, against the seeming immobility of a vertically falling torrent, one may distinguish 200 feet below the tiny form of a woman walking in the valley. The little phrase had just appeared, distant but graceful, protected by the long, gradual unfurling of its transparent, incessant, and sonorous curtain, and Swann, in his heart of hearts, turned to it, spoke to it as to a confidant, in the secret of his love, as to a friend of Odette, who would assure him that he need pay no attention to this Forqueville. "Ah, you've come too late," Madame Verdun greeted one of the faithful, whose invitation had been only to look in after dinner. "We've been having a simply incomparable bricot." "You've never heard such eloquence. But he's gone. Isn't that so, Monsieur Swann? I believe it's the first time you've met him," she went on, to emphasize the fact that it was to her that Swann owed the introduction. "Isn't that so? Wasn't he delicious, our bricot?" Swann bowed politely. "No, you weren't interested?" she asked dryly. "Oh, but I assure you I was quite enthralled. He is perhaps a little too peremptory, a little too jovial for my taste. I should like to see him a little less confident at times, a little more tolerant. But he feels that he knows a great deal, and on the whole he seems a very sound fellow." The party broke up very late. Cottard's first words to his wife were, "I've rarely seen Madame Verdun in such form as she was tonight." "What exactly is your Madame Verdun? A bit of a bad hat, eh?" said Forqueville to the painter, to whom he had offered a lift. Odette watched his departure with regret. She dared not refuse to let Swann take her home, but she was moody and irritable in the carriage, and when he asked whether he might come in, replied, "I suppose so," with an impatient shrug of her shoulders. But they had all gone. Madame Verdun said to her husband, "Did you notice the way Swann laughed? Such an idiotic laugh, when we spoke about Madame le Tremorle." She had remarked more than once how Swann and Forqueville suppressed the particle de before the lady's name, never doubting that it was done on purpose, to show that they were not afraid of a title. She had made up her mind to imitate their arrogance, but had not quite grasped what grammatical form it ought to take. Moreover, the natural corruptness of her speech overcoming her implacable republicanism, she still said instinctively, the de la Tremorles, or rather by an abbreviation sanctified by the usage of music-hall singers and the writers of the captions beneath caricatures who lead the de la Tremorle. But she corrected herself at once to Madame la Tremorle, the Duchess, as Swann calls her, she added ironically, with a smile which proved that she was merely quoting, and would not herself accept the least responsibility for a classification so puerile and absurd. "I don't mind saying that I thought him extremely stupid." Monsieur Verdun took it up. "He's not sincere. He's a crafty customer, always hovering between one side and the other. He's always trying to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. What a difference between him and Forqueville. There at least you have a man who tells you straight out what he thinks. Either you agree with him or you don't, not like the other fellow who's never definitively fish or fowl. Did you notice, by the way, that Odette seemed all out for Forkville, and I don't blame her either. And then, after all, if Swann tries to come the man of fashion over us, the champion of distressed duchesses at any rate, the other man has got a title. He's always Comte de Forkville. He let the words slip delicately from his lips, as though, familiar with every page of the history of that dignity, he were making a scrupulously exact estimate of its value in retaliation to others of the sort. I don't mind saying, Madame Verdun went on, that he saw fit to utter some most venomous and quite absurd insinuations against Procope. Naturally, once he saw that Procope was popular in this house, it was a way of hitting back at us and spoiling our party. I know his sort, the dear good friend of the family who pulls you all to pieces on the stairs as he's going away. Didn't I say so? Retorted her husband. He's simply a failure. A poor little wretch who goes through life mad with jealousy of anything that's at all big. Had the truth been known, there was not one of the faithful who was not infinitely more malicious than Swann, but the others would all take the precaution of tempering their malice with obvious pleasantries, with little sparks of emotion and cordiality. There are certain original and distinguished authors in whom the least freedom of speech is thought revolting because they have not begun by flattering the public taste and serving up to them the commonplace expressions which are used. It was by this same process that Swann infuriated Monsieur Verdun. In his case, as in theirs, it was the novelty of his language which led his audience to suspect the blackness of his designs. Swann was still unconscious of the disgrace that threatened him at the Verduns. He continued to regard all their absurdities in the most rosy light through the admiring eyes of love. As a rule, he made no appointments with Odette, except for the evenings. He was afraid of her growing tired of him if he visited her during the day as well. At the same time, he was reluctant to forfeit, even for an hour, the place he held in her thoughts, and so was constantly looking out for an opportunity of claiming her attention. In any way, that would not be displeasing to her. If in a florist's or a jeweler's window a plant or an ornament caught his eye, he would at once think of sending them to Odette, imagining that the pleasure which the casual sight of them had given him would instinctively be felt also by her, and would increase her affection for himself, and would order them to be taken at once to the Rue La Pérouse, so as to accelerate the moment in which, as she received an offering from him, he might feel himself, in a sense, transported into her presence. He was particularly anxious always that she should receive those presents before she went out for the evening, so that her sense of gratitude towards him might give him additional tenderness to her welcome when he arrived at the Verduns, might even, for all he knew, if the shopkeeper made haste, bring him a letter from her before dinner, or herself in person upon his doorstep, come on a little extraordinary visit, thinks, as in earlier phase, when he had experimented with the reflex action of anger and contempt upon her character, he sought now by that of gratification to elicit from her fresh particles of her intimate feelings, which he had never yet revealed. Often she was embarrassed by lack of money, and under pressure from a creditor who would come to him for assistance. He enjoyed this, as he enjoyed everything which could impress Odette with his love for herself, or merely with his influence, with the extent of the use that she might make of him. Probably if anyone had said to him at the beginning, "It's your position that attracts her," or at this stage, "It's your money that she's really in love with," he would not have believed the suggestion, nor would he have been greatly distressed by the thought that people supposed her to be attached to him, the people felt them to be united by any ties so binding as those of snobbishness or wealth. But even if he had accepted the possibility, it might not have caused him any suffering to discover that Odette's love for him was based upon a foundation more lasting than mere affection, or any attractive qualities which she might have found in him, on a sound commercial interest, an interest which would postpone forever the fatal day on which she might be tempted to bring their relations to an end. For the moment, while he lavished presents upon her and performed all manners of services, he could rely on advantages not contained in his person or in his intellect, could forego the endless killing effort to make himself attractive. And this delight in being a lover, in living by love alone, of the reality of which he was inclined to be doubtful, the price which, in the long run, he must pay for it, as a dilettante in immaterial sensations, enhanced its value in his eyes, as one sees people who are doubtful whether the sight of the sea or the sound of its waves are really enjoyable, become convinced that they are, as also of the rare quality and absolute detachment of their own taste. When they have agreed to pay several pounds a day for a room in a hotel from which that sight and that sound may be enjoyed. One day, when reflections of this order had brought him once again to the memory of the time when someone had spoken to him of Odette as a kept woman, when once again he had amused himself with constraint, that strange personification, the kept woman, an iridescent mixture of unknown and demoniacal qualities, embroidered as in some fantasy of Gustave Moreau, with poison-dripping flowers interwoven with precious jewels, with that Odette upon whose face he had watched the passage of the same expressions of pity for a sufferer, resentment of an act of injustice, gratitude for an act of kindness, which he had seen in earlier days on his own mother's face and on the faces of friends, that Odette whose conversation had so frequently turned on things that he himself knew better than anyone, his collections, his room, his old servant, his banker, who kept all his title deeds and bonds. The thought of the banker reminded him that he must call on him shortly to draw some money, and indeed if, during the current month, he were to come less liberally to the aid of Odette in her financial difficulties than in the month before when he had given her 5,000 francs, if he refrained from offering her a diamond necklace for which she longed, he would be allowing her admiration for his generosity to decline. That gratitude which had made him so happy, and would even be running the risk of her imagining that his love for her, as she saw its visible manifestations, fewer, had itself diminished, and then suddenly he asked himself whether that was not precisely what was implied by keeping a woman, and if, in fact, the idea of keeping could be derived from elements not at all mysterious nor perverse, but belonging to the intimate routine of his daily life, such as that 1,000-franc note, a familiar and domestic object, torn in places and mended with gummed paper, which his valet, after paying the household accounts and the rent, had locked up in a drawer in the old writing-desk whence he had extracted it to send it with 4 others to Odette, and whether it was not possible to apply to Odette, since he had known her, for he had never imagined a moment that she could ever have taken a penny from anyone else before, that title which he had believed so wholly inapplicable to her, of kept woman. He could not explore the idea further, for a sudden access of that mental lethargy which was with him congenital, intermittent, and providential, happened at that very moment, to extinguish every particle of light in his brain as instantaneously as, at a later period, when electric lighting had been everywhere installed, it became possible merely by fingering a switch to cut off all the supply of light from the house. His mind fumbled for a moment in the darkness. He took off his spectacles, wiped the glasses, passed his hands over his eyes, but saw no light until he found himself face to face with a wholly different idea. The realization that he must endeavor in the coming month to send Odette 6,000 or 7,000 franc notes instead of 5, simply as a surprise for her and to give her pleasure. In the evening, when he did not stay at home until it was time to meet Odette at the Verdurns, or rather at one of the open-air restaurants which they liked to frequent in the Bois, and especially at St. Cloud, he would go to dine in one of those fashionable houses in which at one time he had been a constant guest. He did not wish to lose touch with people who, for all that he knew, might be of use some day to Odette, and thanks to whom he was often in the meantime able to procure for her some privilege or pleasure. Besides, he had been used for so long to the refinement and comfort of good society that side by side with this contempt there had grown up also a desperate need for it, with the result that when he had reached the point after which the humblest lodgings appeared to him as precisely on a par with the most pricely mansions, his senses were so thoroughly accustomed to the latter that he could not enter the former without feeling acute discomfort. He had the same regard to a degree of identity which they would never have suspected for the little families with small incomes who asked him to dance in their flats, straight upstairs to the 5th floor, and the door on the left, as for the Princesse de Parme, who gave the most splendid parties in Paris, but he had not the feeling of being actually at the ball. When he found himself herded with the fathers of families in the bedroom of the lady of the house, while the spectacle of wash-hand stands covered with towels and of beds converted into cloak-rooms with the mass of hats and greatcoats sprawling over their counterpanes, gave him the same stifling sensation that nowadays people who have been used for half a lifetime to electric light derive from a candle that needs to be snuffed. If he were dining out, he would order his carriage for 7:30 while he changed his clothes. He would be wandering all the time about Odette, and in this way was never alone, for the constant thought of Odette gave to the moments in which he was separated from her the same peculiar charm as to those in which she was at his side. He would get into his carriage and drive off, but he knew that this thought had jumped in after him and had settled down upon his knee, like a pet animal which he might take everywhere, and would keep with him at the dinner-table, unobserved by his fellow guests. He would stroke it, fondle it, warm himself with it, and, as a feeling of languor swept over him, would give way to a slight shuddering movement which contracted his throat and nostrils. A new experience this, as he fastened the bunch of columbines in his buttonhole. He had for some time been feeling neither well nor happy, especially since Odette had brought Forqueville to the Verdurns, and he would have liked to go away for a while to rest in the country. But he could never summon up courage to leave Paris, even for a day, while Odette was there. The weather was warm. It was the finest part of the spring, and for all that he was driving through a city of stone to immure himself in houses without grass or garden, what was incessantly before his eyes was a park, which he owned, near Cambrai, where at 4 in the afternoon, before coming to the asparagus bed, thanks to the breeze that was wafted across the fields from Mescalis, he could enjoy the fragrant coolness of the air as well beneath an arbor of hornbeams in the garden as by the bank of a pond fringed with forget-me-nots and iris, and where, when he sat down to dinner, trained and twined by the gardener's skilful hand, there ran all about his table currant bush and rose. After dinner, if he had an early appointment in the Bois or at St. Cloud, he would rise from table and leave the house so abruptly, especially if it threatened to rain, and so to scatter the faithful before their normal time, that on one occasion the Princess d'Islams, at whose house dinner had been so late that Swann had left before the coffee came in to join the Verdurns on the island in the Bois, observed, "Really, if Swann were 30 years older and had diabetes, there might be some excuse for his running away like that. He seems to look upon us all as a joke." He persuaded himself that the springtime charm, which he could not go down to Cambrai to enjoy, he would find at least on the Cygnus or St. Cloud, but as he could think only of Odette, he would return home, not knowing if he had tasted the fragrance of the young leaves or if the moon had been shining. He would be welcomed by the little phrase from the sonata played in the garden on the restaurant piano. If there was none in the garden, the Verdurns would have taken immense pains to have a piano brought out, either from a private room or from the restaurant itself. Not because Swann was now restored to favor, far from it, but the idea of arranging an ingenious form of entertainment for someone, even for someone whom they disliked, would stimulate them during the time spent in its preparation to a momentary sense of cordiality and affection. Now and then he would find himself that another fine spring evening was drawing to close, and would force himself to notice the trees and the sky. But the state of excitement into which Odette's presence never failed to throw him added a feverish ailment which, for some time now, had scarcely left him, robbed him of that sense of quiet and comfort which is an indispensable background to the impressions that we derive from nature.